The Pokemon fanbase has a lot of different facets that cater to a lot of different interests. One interest that has been fairly prominent throughout the entire series' lifespan is that of the fan game community. One way that this is done quite frequently is by taking ROMs, usually for the GBA, and modifying them to create new games. However, as you get into the ROM hacking space, you sort of start to realize that even though you can do a fair amount of impressive things, it is a fairly limiting environment to work in. Modifying a ROM constrains you to the way that that original game was developed. There's no real way of getting around that. However, the reason that ROMs are so popular is that hacking a ROM can actually be a fairly easy task for those with minimal technical experience. But the question arises, is there perhaps a way that we can recreate that experience in an environment that's going to give us a little bit more flexibility with how our games look? That is what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to discuss the Pokémon Essentials kit for RPG Maker XP. This kit has a fairly lengthy history, first appearing in 2007, created by a user by the name of Posil. Or is it Pokal? I'm actually not sure how it's pronounced. This kit actually was not the first of its kind. It was derived from what was known as Flame Guru's starter kit, which was created around the same time. However, Posil is not super involved in Pokemon Essentials development anymore. As of 2011, it has changed hands to a developer by the name of Maruno, who remains the maintainer ever since. However, this kit is not without its fair share of controversy. The first was the launch of Pokemon Uranium, a game developed with the kit, which was taken down by Nintendo. Later, the kit itself would be subject to a DMCA complaint from Nintendo, which caused the kit to go down, meaning all of its download links on the internet were completely scrubbed. However, that's not the end of this kit's story. Like with anything, it began to circulate more covertly on GitHub and other platforms because once something's on the internet, it's kind of hard for a company to snuff it out completely. So it became harder to access, but it was still something that you could get your hands on if you wanted to. However, it seems like the copyright claim didn't completely deter the people working on it, and development seemingly continued on the kit, where on September 2nd, 2020, a new version of the Pokemon Essentials kit was released. And since then, development has seemed to continue, with new versions continually coming out on a regular basis. And so, today we're going to take a look not so much at the history of this kit and the games made with it, but more on the side of how exactly it works. What are perhaps the layers that make up a tool like this that make it easy to create your own Pokemon game? Or, in fact, any game for that matter. So the first place to start is probably, what's the first thing you see when you open up a game engine? Well, typically we see a series of tools used for editing data about the game without any concern about how that data is actually programmed. RPG Maker has several different menus that you can go through. The first is its database menu, which has a bunch of various tabs, each defining a different aspect of an RPG, such as playable characters, abilities, equipment, and so forth. On top of that, RPG Maker has its own built-in map editor, allowing you to create tile sets and then easily put together a map using those. These tile sets automatically handle things such as collision, and also the tile layering. Beyond just the layout of the map, RPG Maker also gives the ability to edit the contents of the map. Because if you have an empty map, that's cool, but it needs to actually have some stuff in it. Obviously, because it's geared for turn-based RPGs, you can set the random encounters on the map, but you can also place down various events. These represent all sorts of various things, just characters, warp points, doors, you name it. When editing an event, the user is able to select from a series of commands, which are then executed in sequence. The beauty of these commands is, while the general logic of an event looks like more technical programming, it's a fairly high level of abstraction. These represent things that are commonplace in an RPG. Things like displaying text, entering a battle, opening the menu, shops. Almost all of them are fairly easy things to understand without having to have too much technical knowledge. And RPG Maker is not the only engine to do this. There are plenty of other engines which use some sort of drag and drop programming system. And those are usually not as high level as RPG Maker, but it's still a way to create games without having to directly know how to write any code. However, if you look at the type of games RPG Maker produces and a Pokemon game, those are two very different things. The way a Pokemon game works is so fundamentally different from most other JRPGs that a tool designed to create JRPGs is going to be fairly limiting. So that brings us to the next layer down from this tool, the actual scripting interface of the game engine. So, starting with RPG Maker XP and continuing to the present day, the RPG Maker engine allows users to create additional custom scripts that can be used with the engine. RPG Maker XP, VX, and VX Ace all used a language known as Ruby for its scripting, before switching to JavaScript in later versions, which that latter choice is definitely a decision. There totally was no other well-known, well-liked, highly used scripting language that they could have used instead. I'm gonna just move on because if I get into my dislike of JavaScript, we'll be here all day. But back to Ruby. The language was created in Japan by a man by the name of Yukihiro Matsumoto in 1993. There are several features about this language that make it a good candidate for RPG Maker. The first is that it is what's known as an object-oriented language, which is a term I spent a decent chunk of time trying to find a definition for, and I got a whole bunch of different ones, and so it was like, I need a definition that I want to use, but all the online sources are giving slightly different variations of the same definition, and all my old college textbooks, which I was reading for the first time working on this video, all just assumed you already knew what it meant. So instead, I've come up with what I think is probably the most reasonable definition for a video like this. I've decided to define object-oriented programming as the following: a paradigm of programming which organizes data into more meaningful chunks called objects, which are defined in classes, that can also contain reusable chunks of code called methods. There's a lot more to it than that, but for the sake of this video, especially since my channel is not aimed exclusively at people with technical experience, we're going to work with the simpler definition. And obviously, a language that has the ability to group data like that is fairly helpful. For an RPG, it allows you to easily define items and equipment, as well as the playable characters, and even things like the battle system can be easily defined as classes, which then make it fairly easy to organize all the various pieces of game logic. Another feature about Ruby that makes it a fairly good language is that it's what's known as dynamically typed. And the easiest way to explain that is that in other languages, the type of data you're manipulating has to be declared as you're writing the program. You have to say that this chunk of data represents a number, and it is a number for its entire lifespan. Ruby, that is not the case. That is all determined while the code is running, which gives you significantly more flexibility, and frankly gives you less syntax that you need to learn and worry about when you're first learning the language, which makes it fairly good as a first programming language. In fact, it was my first programming language, which I don't think many people can say that their first programming language was Ruby. This type system is sometimes also known as duck typing, which is derived from the phrase, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. But since the code doesn't worry about the actual type of any particular data that's passed through, it means that basically any object within the code, as long as it has the data fields and methods that that code is calling for, it can work. And this obviously can cause some problems and leads to some scaling issues, which is why you'll find that most dynamically typed languages actually introduce their own type system. The last feature about Ruby that makes it a good candidate for a game engine like this is that it's what's known as an interpreted language. A lot of programming languages are what are referred to as compiled. That is, the code is taken and turned into the machine code that the computer actually understands before it's ever run. Interpreted languages, on the other hand, are run as plain text, and the individual lines are converted into machine instructions at runtime. This provides a ton of flexibility to the language. This is common for things like game engines or plugins for different programs such as Adobe Premiere, which also uses JavaScript for some stupid fucking reason. The primary advantage of an interpreted language is that you have a fairly quick turnaround when developing. Since there's no compilation phase, it's very easy to make changes and run it and see if those changes work or not. However, with that fast development time comes slower performance. Interpreted languages are famously significantly slower than their compiled counterparts. However, oftentimes that performance is either negligible or considered a cost worth taking on for easier development. So to bring this specifically to RPG Maker, the RPG Maker engine exposes a decent chunk of its game logic directly to the user. Things like how it manages the party, and even some of the ways it does the windows and the various screens in the game are all things that you can look at. In fact, you're able to completely edit or even remove these parts of the code if you so desire. And that's the big thing that Pokémon Essentials does, is it takes out a decent chunk of the code that RPG Maker XP had already defined, and then writes its whole new engine on top of that. This means that a lot of the commands in the event system that are normally used in RPG Maker games don't do anything here. And so everything from receiving a Pokemon to getting items and whatnot are all defined through script calls, essentially small pieces of code that are called inside the event. However, the one disadvantage of scripting in RPG Maker is that the way you edit the code is not the best. So the way they decided to package the code files is to put them in a basically single compressed archive that is only accessible from within the engine. This means that editing code has to be done in their editor, which has close to no additional features that make it more pleasant to program. The best you get is certain keywords are highlighted in a different color. But beyond that, a lot of different things such as auto-completion, auto-indenting are just completely missing from this editor. The current codebase for Pokémon Essentials on GitHub actually employs such a tactic, having all of the individual scripts as separate files that are then read in by the one script that is inside the actual scripts file. So obviously I'm able to read and write Ruby code. So how exactly does the Pokémon Essentials codebase look? Well, honestly, a lot better than I thought it was going to be for something like this. Because I'm a nerd and curious like that, I took the Essentials codebase and ran it through what's known as a static analyzer. That's a tool that basically looks at code and, without running any of it, tells you any potential problems that might arise. This includes things such as major potential bugs that need to be addressed, as well as smaller things that are going to make the code less maintainable going forward. And looking at those reports, Pokémon Essentials is actually pretty decent on that respect. The tool I used only identified one bug within the code, but everything else was on the maintainability side. The vast majority of the over 7,000 issues it identified had to do with the fact that Pokémon Essentials uses a naming convention that isn't the same one that Ruby likes. The one thing it did flag is that a lot of pieces of code have too much going on and could be broken up a little bit more, but beyond that and some other intentionality issues, there's nothing really major that stuck out to me when I looked through the report. It gets a little bit messy, but that's fairly normal for a codebase like this, especially one that probably doesn't have a completely rigid system for keeping code quality. However, that's not the whole picture when it comes to RPG Maker. RPG Maker doesn't stop at the Ruby code. I mentioned that the RPG Maker engine code is visible, but that's not completely true. Most of it is visible, but there is a chunk that is not. There is a segment of RPG Maker's API that is only accessible by looking at their documentation. And so, what exactly is up with that? Well, part of it is that they're trying to keep some trade secrets, but also the fact that, as I mentioned, scripting languages tend to be slower than compiled languages. And there are certain aspects of a game, such as, say, the graphics, which are fairly performance critical. And so, to do that, you need to bring it to a compiled language. And thankfully, Ruby has support for that. In fact, the actual interpreter for pretty much every scripting language is written in a compiled language. And they frequently give you the ability to create extensions that are in that compiled language. Ruby is no such exception. And so it seems like part of the RPG Maker engine is written in that way, contained within a pre-compiled binary file that cannot be accessed. And while this is the correct decision for this and most other game engines, this does create an issue of limiting you to the way that the RPG Maker engine was written at the time, which, as the name might suggest, is quite old. RPG Maker XP was developed for Windows XP. And not just that, it was developed only for Windows XP. Prior to RPG Maker MV and the switch to JavaScript, RPG Maker games could only run on Windows platforms. However, that is not the answer that some Mac and Linux users settled for. Instead, they decided to not just put up with the technical limitations of the engine, as well as the platform restriction, but instead, what if we created our own version of RPG Maker? And that they did. The way they were able to do this is, as I mentioned, the portion of RPG Maker that is not directly visible as code is still well defined. All of the different pieces of functionality that can be called from Ruby are explicitly defined and given explanations as to what they do. This allows a programmer to go in and create their own version that hooks up into that particular interface. And thus we saw the birth of two different projects. The first is one called MKXP, a very basic bare bones recreation of RPG Maker. This one is primarily written in C++ with a little bit of C code supporting it, such as the part where it actually has to hook up into Ruby. However, that's not the version that Pokémon Essentials uses. Pokémon Essentials uses a different version known as MKXP-Z. And this is essentially an enhanced version of MKXP, as the name might imply. This version has more functionality and is designed to basically yield better performance and break through the restrictions of the RPG Maker engine. However, it shares a decent chunk of its code with the base version. Ultimately, what this does is it allows us to use more efficient processes, as well as various open source libraries, which enable programmers to abstract away the parts that were dependent on the Windows API, allowing it to run on different platforms, as those libraries have definitions within them for each of the different platforms that it can run on. And this is truly the beauty of the open source community. They create so much of the code that we use for everything. Like, if you look at a lot of professional software, they're relying so heavily on open source libraries. It's not even funny, honestly. Like, people who program in their spare time are doing all of the major work that the rest of us then take into our day jobs. And this is the part of the video where I finally explain why exactly I disappeared for as long as I did. So my initial plan for this video is to basically look at Pokémon Essentials, refamiliarize myself with everything the engine had to offer, and then take some of the code that I wrote back in the day and update it so that it runs on the newest version. However, as I was editing, I found that there were aspects of the debugging process that I used to do all the time when I primarily worked in RPG Maker, but have since found better ways and not wanted to put up with. And the big issue with both the original RPG Maker and MKXP-Z is that both of them bake the Ruby interpreter into the game executable, which is at odds with the way most code editors run the code. They invoke the Ruby interpreter as a standalone program. And so, I was not able to debug the way I wanted to. However, MKXP-Z is completely open source. And so, me, being actually fairly proficient with C++, I'm not an expert. And if anyone ever says they're an expert at C++, run. They're lying. There is so much stuff in that language that there is no one that you could call an expert in it. Either way though, what I sought to do was take MKXP-Z from a standalone executable file and turn it into essentially a package library that could be run from Ruby, what Ruby refers to as a gem. And so there were several things that I had to do in order to get this to work. The first is that I had to define a new additional piece of the API, which would allow the programmer to open up the game window from a script file. And that was the easy part. The hard part was taking what was already there and converting that in a way that hooks up to that API. So the way that MKXP-Z works initially is it does a whole bunch of startup, opens the window, and then starts its baked-in interpreter. Obviously, I can't do that. The interpreter is what's doing all the running. So I had to take everything that was done at startup and run that through that new API endpoint. However, the biggest challenge is that MKXP-Z runs in a fairly interesting way. It does all that startup and then pulls for user input on what's called the main thread. That is the process of execution that is launched when the program begins, and then creates another parallel process of execution to actually run the game scripts. So obviously I had to flip those two, running all of the event processing on a secondary thread in the background. This means that I had to do a little bit of thread coordination in order to basically have the main thread call the startup, and then wait for that background thread to get to a certain point in its execution before allowing the rest of the Ruby code to continue. The other challenge was, because of the way that MKXP-Z is set up, it shuts down the Ruby interpreter before the window. That is not quite possible in this approach. So I had to ensure that when the game shuts down, the window doesn't cause the game to crash or hang, because that can cause additional problems. So, I mean, that's a fairly short list of things to do. So that's fairly easy, right? As of recording, I have authored 349 separate commits into my repository. That is 349 different sets of changes, some of varying size too. There were some that definitely should have been several commits, but I just been working all day and forgot to commit them as I was going. And also there are a few that are basically just merge commits, and I don't want to get into the semantics of how Git works right now. But let's just say I wrote a lot. And as I mentioned, C++ is thankfully one of my stronger languages, so I was able to at least work my way through it and figure out how everything was done. Was it fun? Yeah, kinda. I mean, there are better languages out there. I just happen to know this one really well, and it's one that has pretty decent performance. And eventually I did get that all working. However, that was not the end state. Running it in the editor was one half of the equation. The other half was I wanted to be able to see if I could take Pokémon Essentials and create what are essentially called automated tests. To basically explain this is that what programmers will do is we will basically write additional code to test our other code to make sure that that code works. And then we also have to do additional testing on our own to make sure that that test code is actually testing the other code correctly. And if that's confusing, just don't think about it too hard. The ultimate plan was to drop it into what's called a CI/CD pipeline. That stands for continuous integration and continuous deployment. Essentially, anytime changes to the code are pushed up to the main repository, the repository is able to run automated processes to test and verify that the code works before actually being sent off into a production environment. And I wanted to see if I could do the same thing for RPG Maker. And so, after a ton of fighting, I eventually did it. I eventually got everything I wanted out of it. Was it worth it? For the amount of work I did, probably not, but it's a fairly impressive feat. I learned a lot about different tools that I probably would have never been exposed to otherwise, so it was a fairly interesting and enlightening experience. And also, part of the reason I disappeared for a while, because I started this in October and was doing this kind of non-stop until November, when I also had to put up with moving. But the moving part is done, and I basically got the MKXP-Z portion where I want it to. I still want to do a little bit more with the RPG Maker tool, and then maybe, if you're interested, I can do a second video on Pokémon Essentials that covers what I did there. But anyways, if you're curious to check out what exactly I did, I've linked both repositories to my fork of MKXP-Z and my fork of the Pokémon Essentials code that has some of my plugins and the automated processes that I spoke about in it, for those of you who are just curious and want to see what exactly I've been doing. And with that, I think we've pretty much wrapped up here. That is pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. Well, maybe one more thing I wanted to cover real quick. Hey, buddy. Hey, buddy. I posted a picture of him back when I first got him, but I thought I would at least, put him on camera at least once. Say hi to the YouTube people, Ezra. Right over there. That's the camera. The camera. Say hi. This is the second time I recorded this video, and both times when I actually went to put him on camera, he was asleep, so this time though, I think this time he's a little less out of it. I think he's just licking me because these lights make me sweat a lot, so, and dogs like to lick up sweat for some reason, but either way, we're done here. I will see you guys in the next video. Hopefully something a little more conventional, probably a review of some type, but until then, I'll see you guys.